How did the mountains of Appalachia become the last refuge for songs that England had forgotten? In the remote mountains of Kentucky, sometime around 1916, a woman stands on her front porch. Her name is lost to history, but her voice, thin, high, and unaccompanied, cuts through the mountain air like a thread connecting two worlds. She's singing a song about a young man dying of love, spurned by a cruel maiden named Barbara Allen. 4,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean, this same song once echoed through the streets of London, the halls of Edinburgh, the countryside of Yorkshire. But there's something extraordinary happening here, something that would baffle the scholars who came seeking it. This woman is singing a version of the song more authentic, more preserved than anything that could be found in England itself. How is this possible? Welcome back to Legends from the Holler. Now, to understand this mystery, we need to go back to 1882 to Harvard University, where a scholar named Francis James Child published the final volume of what would become known as the Child Ballads, a massive collection of 305 traditional British folk songs, gathered from manuscripts, broadsheets, and oral tradition. These weren't simple ditties or tavern songs. These were epic narratives, tales of murder and betrayal, supernatural encounters, tragic lovers, outlaws, and nobles. Songs like Lord Randall, poisoned by his true love; Tam Lin, the story of a mortal man held captive by the Queen of Fairies; The Two Sisters, where one sister drowns another out of jealousy, and a harp is made from her bones that sings out the truth. Child believed he was preserving a dying tradition, and he was right, but not in the way he imagined. By the early 1900s, these ancient ballads had all but vanished from England. Industrialization, urbanization, mass literacy. They had transformed British culture. The old songs were being replaced by music hall entertainments, printed sheet music, and eventually recorded sound. But 3,000 miles away, in a landscape the modern world had barely touched, those same songs were alive and thriving. The question is, how did they get there? The story begins in the 1700s in the borderlands between England and Scotland, a region that had known centuries of violence, cattle raids, and clan warfare. The people there, Scots-Irish, Northern English, Scottish lowlanders, they carried their culture in their memories, because often memories were all they could take. Starting around 1717 and continuing for decades, these border people began crossing the Atlantic. They came for many reasons: religious persecution, economic hardship, the promise of land. They landed in Philadelphia, Baltimore, Charleston, and then they kept moving. They moved west into the mountains. The Scots-Irish weren't looking for the easiest land or the most fertile valleys. They were looking for isolation and for places where they could live on their own terms. The Appalachian Mountains gave them that. Steep ridges, narrow valleys, terrain that was hard to farm but perfect for remaining undisturbed. And here's where the preservation begins. These settlers brought very little with them. No books. Usually many couldn't read. What they brought was oral culture, stories, proverbs, and songs. Hundreds upon hundreds of songs. Imagine the Appalachian hollows in the 1700s and 1800s. Families living miles apart, connected by footpaths and creek beds. No newspapers, no mail service, no traveling performers. The outside world might as well have been on another planet. In this isolation, something remarkable happened. The ballads weren't just preserved, they were necessary. These songs weren't entertainment in the way we think of it today. They were the news, the history books, and the moral instruction. They were emotional catharsis. When you live in a place where the most exciting thing that happens all month might be a visit from a neighbor, these songs become incredibly important. They're how you pass the time, yes. But they're also how you teach children about the world, about right and wrong, about the consequences of jealousy or betrayal or violence. A mother singing Little Mattie Groves while churning butter wasn't just entertaining her children. She was teaching them about the dangers of adultery, A family singing Lord Randall around the fire wasn't just passing time. They were sharing a story about trust and betrayal that was already 3 centuries old. And because these communities were so isolated, because they had no contact with the evolving musical trends of England or even the American coastal cities, the songs remained remarkably unchanged. The melodies, the archaic language, the plot details, they were passed down generation after generation, parent to child, in nearly pristine form. The mountains had become a time capsule. August 1916, a British musicologist named Cecil Sharp steps off a train in Asheville, North Carolina. He's 57 years old, not in the best of health, and he's about to make a discovery that will consume the rest of his life. Sharp had come to America with his colleague, Maud Carpelese, on what they thought would be a brief visit. They'd heard rumors, whispers, really, that some of the old English ballads might still exist in the southern mountains, but they weren't prepared for what they found. The first time Sharp heard someone sing Barbara Allen in Appalachia, he was stunned. This wasn't some corrupted, half-forgotten fragment. This was the complete ballad, with verses that hadn't been heard in England in 100 years, sung in a dialect that preserved pronunciations from Elizabethan English. Over the next 2 years, Sharp and Carpelese traveled deep into the mountains. They went on horseback, on foot, into hollows where outsiders rarely ventured. And what they discovered was extraordinary. They met Mrs. Jane Gentry of Hot Springs, North Carolina, who knew 64 traditional songs. They met a woman in Virginia who sang the Elfin Knight with verses Sharp had only seen in manuscripts from the 1600s. They encountered families who could sing entire ballad cycles. 10, 15, 20 songs passed down through 7 or 8 generations. And many of these singers were illiterate. They'd never seen the words written down. Everything, every verse, every melody, every subtle variation existed only in memory. Sharp collected 1,612 tunes during his time in Appalachia. He filled notebook after notebook with lyrics and melodies, working by lamplight in remote cabins, struggling to capture in musical notation the subtle ornamentations and pitch variations that made these performances so haunting. What Sharp found wasn't a museum. These weren't dead songs being artificially preserved. These were living, breathing traditions. The singers he met weren't thinking about preserving English heritage. They were just singing the songs their grandmothers taught them. But here's what makes this story even more fascinating. The songs hadn't stayed exactly the same. They'd adapted, they'd evolved to fit their new home. The ballad, The House Carpenter, originally a British song about the devil returning to claim his bride, became an American tale of a woman lured away from her family by a mysterious lover. Knights became cowboys. London became the Carolina Mountains. Specific British place names disappeared, replaced by generic American settings or sometimes by specific Appalachian locations. A song about a Scottish border raid might become a song about a feud in the Kentucky mountains. The details changed, but the emotional core remained identical. These were still songs about love and death, honor and betrayal, the supernatural and the everyday. The people singing these songs, they made them their own. If a verse didn't make sense anymore, they'd change it. If a character needed to be someone they could understand, they'd transform it. But the skeleton of the song, the melody, the story structure, that stayed true. In some cases, the Appalachian versions became superior to anything remaining in Britain. The singers added verses, refined melodies, stripped away corruptions that had crept into British versions. They were, without knowing it, acting as careful custodians of a cultural heritage that England had abandoned. The 1920s brought something revolutionary to Appalachia: recording technology. For the first time, these ancient songs could be captured exactly as they were sung, preserved not just in notation but in actual sound. Record companies sent talent scouts into the mountains looking for authentic voices. What they found changed American music forever. You can draw a direct line from those child ballads and Appalachian hollows, to the birth of country music, bluegrass, and the folk revival. The Carter family, Jimmie Rodgers, Bill Monroe, they all grew up hearing these old ballads. Those songs were in their DNA. The Carter family's "Bury Me Beneath the Willow" echoes the structure and sentiment of ancient British death ballads. Bill Monroe's high lonesome sound carries the modal melodies of Elizabethan England. Bob Dylan's early work drew heavily from the same well of traditional ballads, but something was lost in the transition. Recording technology preserved the songs, yes, but it also began to standardize them. Before recordings, every singer had their own version, their own variations. Mrs. Smith's Barbara Allen might be different from Mrs. Jones's, even if they lived in the same valley. But once a recording became popular, it tended to freeze the song. Younger singers would learn from the record, not from their grandparents. The living, evolving tradition began to calcify. There's this ironic tragedy in the history of these ballads. Sharp came to Appalachia just in time. Another 20 years and many of the singers he met would have been gone. But the very act of collecting and recording the songs changed them. Once they entered the commercial world, they became products instead of living traditions. The 1960s folk revival brought renewed interest in the old ballads. Joan Baez, Shirley Collins, Jean Ritchie, they sought out the traditional versions, tried to perform them with respect and authenticity. But by then, the world that had created those songs was largely gone. The last of the old-time singers were dying. The isolated hollows were being reached by roads, electricity, radio, television. The cultural freezer was thawing. And yet, and here's the remarkable part, the songs survive. Today, there are musicians across America and Britain who dedicate themselves to preserving and performing the child ballads. Some strive for historical authenticity, trying to recreate the sound of those mountain singers from a century ago. Others take the songs in new directions, adding modern instrumentation while keeping the old lyrics and melodies intact. When I sing Lord Randall, I'm connecting with something that goes back 400 years or more. Some mother in Scotland sang it to her child in the 1600s. A woman in Kentucky sang it in the 1800s. Cecil Sharp wrote it down in 1916, and now I'm singing it in the 21st century. That's an unbroken chain across centuries and continents. That's extraordinary. The ballads appear in unexpected places. The bluegrass standard Pretty Polly is a direct descendant of the Gosport tragedy, the mountain murder ballad tradition that influenced everyone from Gillian Welch to Tyler Childers traces directly back to those ancient British songs. Every time you hear a modern country song about betrayal or murder told in narrative form, you're hearing an echo of the child ballads. So why does any of this matter? In an age of streaming music and AI-generated songs, why should we care about 400-year-old ballads preserved in mountain hollows? Because these songs tell us something profound about human culture, about how we preserve who we are across time and distance. The Scots-Irish settlers who brought these ballads to Appalachia weren't scholars or archivists. They were poor farmers, many of them illiterate, living hard lives in a harsh landscape. But they carried their culture in the only vessel they had, memory. What happened in Appalachia was a perfect storm of cultural preservation. You had people with a strong oral tradition, geographical isolation that prevented outside influence, and a cultural value system that honored the past. Those three factors combined to create one of the most remarkable examples of cultural continuity in human history. These songs survived because they mattered, not as artifacts or curiosities, but as necessary tools for living. They taught lessons, they provided comfort, they connected people to their past and to each other, and they proved something important. Culture doesn't need institutions or governments or official programs to survive. Sometimes all it needs is people who care enough to remember. There's a beautiful irony in this story. England lost its ballads to progress and modernity. America's isolated mountains preserved them, nearly unchanged. And then, in the 20th century, British folk revivalists came back to Appalachia to relearn the songs their ancestors had forgotten. The circle completed itself. The songs that left Britain in the memories of poor emigrants returned in notebooks and recordings, bringing with them a gift, the sound of what England once was. Preserved in the mountains of the New World, Cecil Sharp died in 1924, not long after his Appalachian journeys, but his work ensured that the songs he'd found would reach new generations. Mod Carpellis continued the work for decades afterward, and the tradition they documented continues to this day. Somewhere in Appalachia today, someone is singing Barbara Allen. Maybe they learned it from their grandmother, who learned it from hers. Maybe they learned it from a recording, or from a folk festival, or from a book. The method of transmission has changed. The context has changed. The world those songs were born into is gone, but the songs remain. Links in an unbroken chain stretching back across 4 centuries, across an ocean. Connecting us to people we'll never know. Preserving voices that would otherwise have been silenced by time. They are the last echoes of England, still resonating in the hills and hollows of Appalachia, still singing to anyone who stops to listen. Thank you for watching Legends from the Holler. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel. That way you won't miss a single video. Let me know in the comments if there is something about Appalachia you would like for me to discuss. I'd love to read your thoughts. See you next time.